On a July afternoon in 1553, on the flooded coastal flats of China, a band of pirates formed up in green and red, saluted the sky to mock the men marching toward them, and then laid stolen treasure out on the open ground between the two lines. Plunder from the villages they'd burned, now used as bait. Any attacker who broke ranks to grab it would be cut down in the scramble. But the men marching at them were Buddhist monks, 120 of them in bamboo armor, faces painted blue, carrying iron staffs. Their commander gave one order: any man who stops for loot loses his head. Nobody stopped. By dark, the pirate band was destroyed, and for 10 more days, men sworn never to kill hunted the survivors along the coast, down to the last one. This is how that happened and why. It starts 2 months earlier on the waterlogged paths of the Yangtze Delta, with those same 120 men walking to war, shaved heads, dark robes, straw sandals pressing into ground still soft from the summer rains, water standing in the ditches on both sides, iron staffs shouldered in single file along the raised field paths. They hadn't marched 1,000 kilometers from some mountain monastery. They were assembled locally in weeks. 18 monks brought from Hangzhou by a monk named Yuekong, 84 raised in Suzhou by another monk Tianyuan, and 18 ordinary soldiers attached to round out the force, walking toward an enemy that had been beating professional soldiers for years. To understand why anyone thought this was a good idea, you need to see that enemy up close. The raiders burning this coast were called Japanese pirates. The label was mostly wrong, and the Chinese state knew it. Its own official history records that in this crisis, roughly 3 in 10 were actually Japanese, and the other 7 were their local followers. Chinese smugglers, Chinese outlaws, men from all over the maritime world drawn by one number: silk that sold for 5 or 6 taels of silver in China fetched about 10 times that in Japan. Trade was banned, so the trade went armed. And these were not men who hit a village and sailed away. They wintered in bases built inland. They campaigned for years at a stretch. They took walled towns. They scouted ground before they moved. One surviving Ming painting of this war shows a raider standing on another man's shoulders, spear grounded for balance, shading his eyes to read the country ahead. A band like the one at Wengjiagang ran to more than 100 fighters, with a chief and a rear camp full of cloth, coin, and grain. When they met government troops, they won, and the reason was physical. A Ming coastal soldier carried a long shield and a short one-handed saber. A raider carried a two-handed sword longer than that saber, or a long spear, or a heavy bow. At the moment the lines touched, the raider's weapon arrived first, every time. But the deeper problem wasn't reach. It was that most of China's coastal army did not exist. On paper, the empire's registers listed around 3 million hereditary soldiers. Observers at the time put the real number near 845,000. The gap was corruption doing its slow work. Officers seized military farmland, turned their soldiers into private laborers, and kept the dead on the rolls to pocket their pay. One coastal garrison had reported 100 warships in its harbor early in the previous century. By 1448, most were diverted or broken up, leaving 3. So when the raids reached the rich delta south of modern Shanghai, the officials responsible faced an ugly arithmetic. The enemy was real. The army was a list of names. Someone had to be sent, and there was almost no one left to send. In 1553, a senior military official in Nanjing named Wang Jiagang signed an answer that sounds absurd and wasn't: a formal written summons calling monks to war. It wasn't a shot in the dark. The Ming state formally recognized 3 monastic fighting traditions: Shaolin first, then Funyu, whose monks had learned their art at Shaolin, then Wutai, famous for its spear method. Monasteries were the one kind of institution in the region where men trained to fight every single day of their lives, and serving officers already took that seriously. A famous general later stood in its courtyard and watched more than 10 monks demonstrate the staff. The reputation was old, and it was earned. Across the whole pirate war, the records say more than 40 Shaolin monks answered the call, and that they usually won. Skill, though, is not command. 120 men from 3 different traditions needed one leader, and the contenders settled it the way you'd hope they would. What happened next comes from the campaign's own chronicler, a military writer who recorded these battles 15 years later and clearly enjoyed telling this part. So take the flourish with a grain of salt even if the outcome is not in doubt. Tianyuan, the Shaolin man from Suzhou, claimed command of the whole force. The Hangzhou contingent refused him. 18 of their monks nominated 8 fighters to put him in his place. They came at him empty-handed first, up the stone steps of a temple terrace, and the steps did half his work for him, feeding them to his fists 2 and 3 at a time instead of 8 at once. So they went and got swords. They came back through the hall itself, and Tianyuan lifted the bar that locked the hall's double doors, a beam of heavy timber as long as a man is tall and then some, and swung it flat, at hip height in great horizontal arcs, not dueling, sweeping. The reach of the bar met the geometry of the terrace, and 8 armed men went down. Yuekong, their leader, submitted on the spot. From that moment, the force had a commander, and no one questioned it again. It still had nothing to fight a war with. Fixing that is the part of this story almost nobody tells. The monks made camp at a temple called Puzhao and quietly hired 2 crews of craftsmen, leather workers at one bench, bamboo workers at another. The leather men built armored coats of the standard Ming pattern, hundreds of small overlapping plates laced together with softened hide, a coat heavy enough to sag on its own weight. The bamboo men split thick bamboo stalks into pale slats and laced them into a rigid outer shell. Leather, worn inside, bamboo outside, a flexible layer to absorb, a hard light layer to turn a blade. This wasn't a monastery emptying its storerooms. It was a procurement operation, then the weapons. The sources say each monk carried an iron staff 7 feet long and 30 caddies in weight, about 18 kilos, and swung it, one account insists, as nimbly as a bamboo cane. Both halves of that sentence cannot be true. And in fact, the 30 caddy figure repeats word for word in later praise poetry, which is what heroic exaggeration looks like. A real combat iron staff in the Shaolin tradition weighed about 9 kilos, and even that, the old manual warns, only a man of great strength could use. Strip away the legend, and what remains is still a 7-foot iron club, a weapon that doesn't care whether your sword is sharp. The staffs didn't work alone. Some men carried steel tridents, a central point standing proud of 2 upturned tines, so the tines could trap a sword while the point went in. A spear and a shield in one object. Others carried hooked spears, a sickle blade curving back behind the head, worked low. Catch an ankle, catch a knee, drag a man off his feet for someone else to finish. And then they did something to their faces. The monks agreed among themselves to paint their faces with indigo, the same blue dye fermented in pits across these very cotton fields, and wrap their shaved heads in red cloth. The account is blunt about why it worked. Raiders who saw blue faces under red cloth took them for divine soldiers, spirit troops out of a temple wall, and their nerve broke before the fighting started. Terror, issued as equipment. One more thing, and it matters for everything that follows. The monks did not blend into the army. They formed their own units, under their own leaders, with imperial officers above them and the regular government troops holding well to the rear. Every man was assigned a weapon and a job to do with it. Some of the 120 were lifelong fighters. Others had been trained for this campaign in a matter of weeks. And when they moved in a formation the manuals called the Long Snake, a narrow, deep column, 2 long spears, and a hooked spear at its head, staffs and blades behind, bows on the wings. The monks were sent in first. Commanders in this war routinely used them as the forward element, with the government troops a clear distance back, and the raiders were waiting in the open, arranged to be looked at. Their chief stood at the center holding a commander's fan, the one raised object in the line that wasn't a weapon. As the monks came on, the whole formation tipped its heads back and saluted the sky. Mockery, performed in unison by men wearing cloth and no armor at all. Drilled behavior without protection. That combination is what veterans look like. Then came the real move, the one from the beginning of this video. The plunder set out on open ground between the lines, close enough to reach, far enough that reaching it meant leaving the formation. Against every government force they'd faced, the scramble for loot had broken the attacker's line at exactly the moment lines matter most. Tianyuan's answer traveled back down a column too long to hear him all at once, passed man to man by voice, because 120 men need no drums. Any man who breaks ranks to seize the pirates' goods and spoils this battle will be beheaded, and there was nothing pulling the other way. These monks did not count heads for merit. In an army where severed heads were the official unit of achievement, cashed in for silver badges, they had opted out of the reward that made soldiers stop mid-battle. Nothing to gain by stopping, everything to lose. The column came level with the treasure, and its pace did not change. Arrows had already been exchanged, shafts standing in the wet earth in the ditch banks. The two sides closed on a narrow path. And then, Tianyuan gave the strangest charge order in this whole war. The monks halted, chanted 3 invocations of the Buddha's name, and on the third screamed, "Kill," and drove in. The spear front hit first, the hooked spear between the 2 long spears, catching men low. Behind them, the staff men stepped into the gaps the spears opened, working at arm's length. And here, the whole procurement operation paid off in seconds. A sword meeting. An iron staff is not a fencing match. The blade is beaten down or slapped aside, and then 9 kilos of metal arrives. Through a guard, through a raised arm, through cloth, because the raiders had no armor to answer it. There's a story told of Yuekong. A raider rushed him, whirling 2 sabers while he sat unmoving, until the last instant when he rose, went over the man, and shattered his skull with 1 blow of the staff. Whatever afternoon that happened on, it is what this weapon was for. The terrain finished what the iron started. Fighters crossed the flooded ditches mid-battle, and one monk is described bracing his staff across the water to get over and kill on the far side. Running raiders hit the dye pits, dropped through the crop line into steeping vats, and were speared where they floundered. The band broke. 60-odd were beheaded in the main clash. Across the wider fighting, the count passed 250. The survivors fled south along the coast, toward the water and the boats, over 100 of their people dead behind them. At a cost to the monks, the record puts at almost nothing. The battle was won by dark. The War of the 120 was just starting, because the monks did the thing no government force in this war ever did. They didn't go back to camp. The pursuit that followed covered about 11 kilometers and took 10 days. Do that arithmetic, 1 kilometer a day. That is not a chase. That is a search. The salt drying grounds along the seawall, where the salt workers kept raking their pans as armed blue-stained men walked past. Hamlet after hamlet, day after day, the same stretch of earthen wall barely moving on the horizon, until the last survivor of Wengjiagang was found and killed on the 31st of July. The fugitives from the battle and the raiders of the rear camp with them. The chronicler who preserved all this wrote 1 sentence in the middle of it that he never explains. In this fighting, he says, the monks took pity on no one. One of them used his iron staff to kill an escaping pirate's wife. She was presumably unarmed, and the man recording it, writing about Buddhist monks, men whose first vow forbids killing, says nothing about that at all. Not a word of justification, not a word of unease. The silence is the most honest thing in the account. The discipline that walked past the treasure without slowing is the same discipline that did not stop for her. So, total victory, delivered by the only functioning force the state could field. If this were the movie version, the coast is saved. It is not the movie version. The next year, the raiders seized the prefectural city of Songjiang itself and killed its magistrate. The crisis got worse after the monks' best day, not better. At a place called Wang Jiagang in 1554, monk units charged well, drove in hard, and were trapped and cut up when the reinforcements behind them never came. And in the autumn of 1555 at Taozhai, the raiders ended the experiment with a trick worthy of the monks' own face paint. They dressed in captured Ming uniforms, carried Ming weapons, and came up behind the monk vanguard looking like friendly reinforcements. The monks waved their own killers forward. The accounts say corpses filled the fields and that the local people wept. And in 1567, the state quietly conceded the point the smugglers had been making all along and legalized the overseas trade. The economics that created the pirates were switched off. That, more than any battle, is what ended the war. Which leaves the question this video started with: how did 120 monks destroy a raider band that China's entire army couldn't stop? Not through mysticism, and not through kung fu movie skill. They won because a monastery was the closest thing to a standing professional force that a hollowed-out empire had left. Men who actually drilled in an army of names on paper, because they were armed and armored for one specific enemy: iron clubs and hooked spears against long swords and no armor, built to order in weeks. And because their discipline was not a halo, it was engineered. A death sentence for looting on one side, no head money on the other. And it held when the oldest trick on this coast was laid out on the ground in front of them. They were a stopgap. The stopgap worked once brilliantly, and then the war outgrew it and killed the men who'd made it work. At the Shaolin monastery today, one stone from all of this still stands, a county placard cut in 1581 in front of the Hall of the Heavenly Kings. It is not a war memorial, it is a tax document. Relief from levies and forced labor, granted because the temple's monks had been sent against the pirates and because some of them did not come back. The men who walked past a fortune without breaking stride are commemorated by an exemption, carved in rock. On this coast, in this century, that was what gratitude looked like, and it outlasted every monument they ever got.